Hi, my name is Alex Konieczny. I'm a historic interpreter here at the beautiful Troy Historic Village. In 1955, Troy became a city, and since then it has grown to a bustling, multicultural city full of people from all over the world. This project, Many Stories, One Heritage, seeks to record the authentic stories of first and second generation Asian American immigrants to this city who now call it home. The following interview you're about to hear is one of 12 interviews we've recorded for the Many Stories, One Heritage project.
My family, let's see, I have my mom, my dad. My dad is deceased now. I have two brothers and two sisters. And most of us all work in the restaurant at Kim's. I came here as a child at age 11, and we basically immigrated with my mom and my brother Larry in 1966 to the United States. My father was already here. He was running Kim's restaurant in Detroit with my Uncle Dale, and that was back in 1966. I came to this country on Thanksgiving Day, November 24th, 1966, and it was a big celebration for us. My dad has never seen me because my father had to leave China in 1955, and coincidentally, he landed in Seattle on the same day I was born, May 20th, 1955. My family, let's see, I have a husband, William Yee, and just the two of us. And we basically all, like I said, work in the restaurant. I was educated here in the United States. I went through junior high, middle school, high school, and university, Wayne State University. I am actually by trade a pharmacist. And when my father passed away in 1997, I came back and worked in the restaurant to help the family out. Currently, my job is manager for my family restaurant. And obviously, I run it with my sister and my brother and the nieces and nephews. So it's a family-run restaurant. So that's basically my family. And, you know, we do have a pretty big family, but mostly it's nieces and nephews. My husband and I don't have any children, but we do have an extended family with nieces and nephews, so.
All right, and let's kind of take you kind of way back. Can you tell us about how your family first started coming to the United States?
Actually, grandfather was the first to come. My grandfather came here in the early 1900s, and he basically worked on the railroad, and he was a very, very industrial man. Because of the fact that he came to this country as an indentured worker, his passage was paid by the railroad, so he had to pay that back in order to leave their employment. So grandfather thought of a way to speed up his departure. He learned how to cook for all the workers. And so he earned extra money after working a hard day's work as a railroad worker. And soon after he paid his wages, he basically went from city to city until he found a city that he was comfortable in. Through his many travel, I know that he'd been through like Indiana and several other states before he finally settled in Michigan. He seemed to like Michigan because some of his village people were already here. At first, he tried his hand as he was coming across the United States, not in restaurant, but in laundry. And he soon discovered that he wasn't good at doing laundry, that he was a much better chef and a restaurant person. So he finally settled in at a restaurant in here. And coincidentally, I ran into someone that kind of knew where my grandfather worked years ago. And that was in Birmingham, downtown Birmingham. It's a restaurant called Pearl. It's no longer there now, but he used to be a waiter at Pearl. And he was very happy there, but not happy enough not to run his own restaurant. After a few years, he did open up Kim's Garden in Detroit, Michigan, and that, I believe he did that early 1950-ish. But while he was under the employment in Pearl, I think it's just called Pearl in Birmingham, he was very, very fortunate to have met the acquaintances of attorney. And the attorney's name is John C.L. Cowan, and he was very instrumental in helping my grandfather. My grandfather didn't really speak the language well, and he didn't know how to communicate well, but he knew well enough to communicate to this attorney that he has family still in China, and he so desperately wanted to bring his family to the United States because China is under communist rule, and he just didn't feel that his family was safe. And Mr. Cowan, having a young family of his own, his wife, Nancy, daughter, Nancy also, Tim, and also Bob, the three of them. And so our attorney was very sympathetic to my grandfather's cause. So he basically helped my grandfather. Somehow got my father to come here, and after a long, extensive pleading and writing and enlisting the help of, I believe, Congressman William Broomfield's help in getting a humanitarian plea to release us from China, because they use many stories, but one of which is this man came to this country, my father came to this country in 1955. I was born in 1955. Never even met the daughter. And separating the family and all the letter and all the pleading. Finally, I think somehow we weakened the communist government, and somehow in a humanitarian basis, they released us in 1963 from China. We left China in 1963. We immigrated to Hong Kong, which is a British colony at that time. And we didn't have a choice, because at that time, United States did not recognize People's Republic of China as a country. So therefore, they had no diplomatic tie. So in order for us to be processed to come to United States, we had to stay in then British colony Hong Kong for 3 years while our paper were being processed. And we were very, very fortunate that we had all this extra help from Congressman Broomfield, as well as John C. Cowan. It's largely because of their helping that my mother, my brother Larry, and myself were able to immigrate to the United States. Coincidentally, Thanksgiving Day, November 24th, 1966. And it's a very significant day because that was the first day I met my father. And of course, we were just all very happy to be together. But there was also sadness too, because when the communist China released us, they also held back 2 more family members, and that would be my oldest brother and my oldest sister. My oldest brother is Kenneth, and my oldest sister is Anne. My oldest brother is 7 years older, and my oldest sister Anne is 5 years older. Because they were older, they were held back because they were much more useful to their movement. And at that time, it was the Red Guard movement. They were trying to, they call it like a cultural revolution. And my brother my brother Kenneth and my sister Anne were both sent, along with thousands of youth at that time, to work on the farm. They were not allowed to go to school. They have to go to the farm, and that was part of their cultural revolution, which at that time, we just, thought that it was not good for them or the country. So therefore, we stepped up our effort to try to bring them to the United States. And very fortunate for us, again, because of all the help that we got, and also because of the immigration law passage in 1965, and also because of Richard Nixon, who opened up the doorway to China. They finally recognized diplomatic relationship with China. My brother Ken and my sister Anne were allowed to immigrate to Hong Kong. I believe they were allowed to go in 1974, and shortly after they were allowed to come to this country. And they came just in time because we were opening up our restaurant in Troy, December 31st of 1974. And they came right before we opened. I think my sister came first, and then my brother came shortly after. They came within a couple weeks of each other. So we were very, very fortunate.
So tell me about what it was like moving from China for you and your family.
What was like moving from China?
Yeah. What was the journey like?
The journey. I remember the journey, but very little. I just remember that it was 1963, I believe, and I can't remember the date or the month. I was very young at that time. I was 8 years old. And I just remember that my mother said to my brother and I, my brother Larry, who is 3 years older, that we have to leave. My mother was given $15 money to take us to Hong Kong. We were given very little time. We were just able to pack our possession and leave. And it was very difficult for my mom, I'm sure. At the time, I did not know it. But she was leaving behind her oldest son and oldest daughter. And at the time, I did not realize how hard the separation was going to be for the family. I was only 8 years old. I didn't know much. But I just knew that as I was crossing the border, I had a beautiful necklace that was given to me at my birth, and that was taken away from me. And they just didn't feel that we should be taking valuable possession, even though it's ours, to across the country, that it should be left behind. So we were basically given $15 total, and my mother had to travel with my brother and myself across. And we were on the railroad, and I remember we boarded the railroad in the morning, and at lunchtime I see everybody else eating. And I asked my mother, I said, "Mom, can we have lunch too, because everybody else is eating and I'm hungry?" And she said to me, she says, all I have is $15. And we just don't know, even though I telegram your uncle in Hong Kong that we were arriving. and I telegrammed my schoolmate, my mother's schoolmate, who we also call Aunt, that we were coming, but we don't know that these telegrams were actually received because we have to send it fast and we have to leave fast. So, and she says, we have to save this $15 for our journey because I don't know what $15 mean in Hong Kong. And so, you know, therefore no lunch, and we'll just give you what I have in the bag for you and your brother to eat. And we will have to, you know, wait until we get there, and hopefully somebody will greet us at the other side. So imagine my mother's happiness when we finished our railroad journey and we boarded and we got there and we saw my aunt, who, well, it's really her schoolmate from her village, but we call her our aunt because they're from the same village. She and her fiancé were there to greet us. And my mother was so happy because she knew she would be taken care of. And we were. And when we got there, we had to board the ferry, and then from the ferry, we went to her place. And she took us in because our uncle obviously did not receive the telegram that we were arriving. So she took us in and she took care of us, and the next day my mom and my aunt took the bus and went to my uncle, so that because my father and my grandfather had sent money there for them to hold in trust so that when we arrived, we would have spending money. And so, you know, my mom and my aunt, and then I'm sure my brother and I all went together on the bus for that. And so that was our journey out of China. And other than that, I don't have too much recollections of my time in China, except that we were able to leave and we were happy to leave.
Are there any stories that your family has shared about while you were still in China?
Excuse me?
Any stories that your family has told, like your mother, for example, about while you were still in China?
Any stories? Not too much, except that my grandmother and my grandfather were very much a humanitarian. My grandfather, of course, left in the early 1900s to come to America to make a living for himself and his family. We were from a village. We were poor peasants from the village. And he just wanted a better living for his family. So he left my aunt and my grandmother at the time to come to this country. And then, of course, he was on worked for the Pacific Railroad. And when he paid his passage and he had extra money, he sent it home, of course, so that my grandmother and my aunt have income for daily income. My grandfather went back to China, I think about 4 years later after he initially left China. And then when he went back to China, then my father was born. My father and my aunt were 5 years apart. And then after that, he came back to the United States and worked some more. And then slowly things changed. There were what we call famine and natural disasters and so on. And my grandfather being a very generous man, saw that his village was destroyed, sent a lot of money back to help his village people rebuild the village. And in fact, he built a bridge for his village, which still stands to this day. And it's named after my grandfather in his own village. And so, you know, he's, you know, very proud that he was able to make money and send back to not only help his family to have a good living, but also to help his village people when they ran into disasters and all that. And my grandmother, coincidentally, was very much educated by the Methodist missionary. When she married my grandfather at age 14, my great-grandmother was a very wise woman. She said, in order for my grandchildren to be educated, my daughter-in-law have to be educated. So she unbound my grandmother's feet and sent her to the Methodists. And so therefore, my grandmother was actually educated. And she can read Chinese, write Chinese, which was unheard of at that time. And she was very religious. And when this disaster hit, my grandmother actually ran a soup kitchen to help her people. So you know, philanthropy runs deep in our family. When the communists took over, there was a lot of animosity against people that had money. And apparently because of the hard work my grandfather did, he was able to send a lot of money back to China to support, at that time, my grandmother, my aunt, and my father. There were the three of them. And at the time, the communists, because of Chairman Mao, they feel that people had money, actually earned the money off of the back of the peasants. So my family, because we did have some money, we were labeled enemy of the people. And my grandmother was under house arrest. And but fortunately, because of all her philanthropy with the soup kitchens and helping out neighbors and all the good work that my grandfather did with helping to rebuild the village when they were in trouble, when their house were damaged, and the bridge and everything that he had done for the village people. The village people were very helpful in protecting my grandmother from house arrest. They basically told her, do not come out. We will find a way to bring food and water to you. And we don't want you to come out, because if you come out, they will persecute you, they will torture you. And it was a very bad time for China at that time, because many of our village people that had money, and they only had money because their loved one went to America to work, and they worked very hard to earn the money, and they all send it back to China to support their family. And a lot of the family were tortured, and some of them even committed suicide because they couldn't take the torture anymore. And some of them were actually tortured to death. So I count myself very fortunate that my grandmother was so well protected by her village people, that they thought so much of her that they protected her. She was singled out to be under house arrest, and somehow my mother protected my father by hiding him somewhere in the city. And my mother somehow had to make journey back to the village where my father was, instead of my father going back to the village, because she feared that if my father were to go back to the village and pay money to the village people, they call it back taxes. Whatever they call it, they wanted money for my family. And supposedly, being the only male in the family, he was supposed to go back. But my mother feared that if my father were to go back to pay the money to the village people that he would be killed. So therefore, she took the risk of going back herself. She had to borrow money from her, well, actually my aunt and her village people, because they somehow escaped the label of being enemy of the people, so their money was not frozen. So they loan us the money to pay the village people for whatever they call it, back taxes or whatever, so that my father's life would be spared. And I remember when my mother married, she had a lot of jewelries. She pawned off all her jewelry, and with whatever money she could borrow from her people, she paid off the taxes. So my father's life was spared. But somehow, that was only for a short little while. Somehow she knew that he had to go. She was pregnant with me at the time, and they made the decision that he had to escape. So being a good swimmer, my father actually swam across the Hong Kong Channel to escape the communists. And he was in Hong Kong for a little while, and then he immigrated to the United States. So that was a very, very courageous thing that he did, because many people could not complete that journey. Swimming across to Hong Kong at night, he couldn't do it during the daytime because it would be very dangerous. But somehow he managed to land in Hong Kong, and he was able to obtain help from his friends and my grandfather, and he came to this country.
When you first arrived in the United States, what was your experience like? How did you feel about it?
I was only 11 years old, so I didn't really feel too much. I was basically protected by my family and my cousins, and it didn't hurt that my cousins are half German and half Chinese. When I say German, I mean German Americans. And they basically bridged the gap for me, and I assimilated into the American culture very easily. I was able to pick up language easily, and it didn't hurt that while I was in Hong Kong for 3 years waiting to come to America, they taught English as a second language for me, so that when I come, I would have an easier time to adapt to the school and the surrounding. But even so, when I came here, I was put back 2 years. I had to, for the next few years, go to summer school every year to make up for the 2 years I was put behind. So by the time I went to high school, I caught up with my age group. And so I graduated on time. My experience as a child was pretty good, except that a couple occasions, because of the fact that we were at war with Vietnam, I was often called communist, Vietnamese, and so on. And I quickly point out to them, I'm not Vietnamese, I'm not communist, I'm actually Chinese American. And so, once I stood my grounds, I was left alone. So.
Did you or your family speak any English prior to coming?
Yeah, my brother and I. Not my mother so much, because she spent all her resources in educating my brother and myself. We went to North Point Methodist School while we were in Hong Kong, and at night we had to get tutored for the English language. So we did speak some English. My brother was much better in picking up the language than I was. And he was put back too, but I'm not sure if he was put back maybe he was put back 2 years like I was, but he also graduated on time. We both went to summer school.
Do you or your family still keep up with any of your cultural traditions from China?
A little bit, not so much. We we were always brought up Christian, so we didn't do too much of the old Chinese custom of the Buddhas or Confucians or what have you. So we're basically follow the American tradition, so to speak, only because of my grandmother's background with the Methodists. She was educated by the Methodists, so we were more Western growing up. And, you know, we were at the time in China, we were not allowed to go to church because they basically banned all the churches. And the only book you're allowed to read is Chairman Mao's Red Book. But my grandmother somehow hid her Bible from being discovered. And she did teach us the Bible from what she was taught as a child, so, yeah.
When you were young, what did you want to do with your life?
When I was young, what did I do with my life?
Or want to do?
Oh, I was very helpful. I always wanted to be in the medical field. Whenever somebody's injured or in need of help, I'm the first to run there and give first aid. So I always thought I was going to be a doctor or some medical field. Yeah, I always knew that. And it became true. I did study to be a pharmacist, and by trade, I am a pharmacist. But again, you know, when my father died in 1997, I had to come back to the restaurant and help my mother to run the restaurant. And then, you know, of course, my brother helped, and so, you know, the whole family helped. It's a family project. And my sister, of course. And now the nieces and nephews as they become of age.
Are any of them looking to take over the restaurant later?
We hope so. We hope so. But right now, I'm still running it, and you know, they're being groomed. They're being groomed. Hopefully, somebody will take the interest to continue. And we're working on third generation already. The restaurant was started by my grandfather in Detroit, and my father carried on in Detroit until he moved out to Troy. So we're the third generation. Hopefully there'll be a fourth generation. Yeah.
Can you tell me a little about the story of how the family restaurant came to be?
The story of how the family restaurant came to be? Well, grandfather needed to make a living. And he basically is a very good cook, because as he was working in San Francisco for the railroad, he moonlight as a chef so he can earn extra money. And then of course, when he had enough money to pay his passage, he came across the country, and he came quite a few states, I think, and he was trying his hand on laundry, like running a laundromat. He discovered that that wasn't what he wanted. He wanted to be a restaurant owner. So when he came and settled in Michigan, his village people helped him out. And of course, he started with Pearl, working as a waiter. And from there, he perfected, you know, running the front, and he already knew how to cook. So when he saved up enough money, and with the help of his attorney friend, John Cowan, he was able to open up his own restaurant in Detroit called Kim's Garden. That was his first restaurant. And he actually bought that restaurant from a Chinese man with a Korean wife. That's why the name is called Kim's. And he thought that was such a lucky name because it really means gold or golden. And so we kept the name as always. And it's made a good living for himself, my uncle, and my father. And from there, we just migrated to Troy, and my uncle went to Livonia after the partnership ended in the early 1970s.
How do you self-identify?
I guess I would call myself Asian American, Chinese American. I think that I'm probably more Americanized than I am Chinese, only because 11 years of my life, I was in either Hong Kong or China, and for 49 of those years, I was educated in America. And coming at such an early age, I'm very grateful to be educated in here. I was given opportunity that I would not have been afforded had I stayed in China. I came at a time that was just right, when people were treated more fairly and also people were educated, allowed the opportunity to be educated. Had I been left in China, I don't think I would have been as well educated, because China at that time was still very male oriented and not so much female oriented. They believe in educating the male, but not so much the female. But by coming at such a young age, my mother always said to me, my grandmother and my mother always said to me, your education stays with you for the rest of your life. No one can ever take that from you. Money can be taken from you, but education cannot. The only thing you can do for yourself is be the best that you can, and also be grateful to your country, your adopted country, because if it's not for your adopted country, you wouldn't be the person that you are. And I was always brought up under the philosophy to do the best for your country. And the phrase that I always remember as I was growing up, and even to this day, is what John F. Kennedy said. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And that to me is my family's legacy, because they've always been given to their country, whether it's in China or United States, all that they have. Whatever they have, they were happy and glad to share with other people. And that's how I was brought up, by my mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, and my father. And they were the same way, and I guess I learned by example. My whole family learned by example. Do the best you can to help others.